I'm Teresa Watanabe, a staff writer with the Los Angeles Times and president of AAJA Los Angeles. As you may know, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of our founding in Los Angeles. So we have lots of great programming for this milestone year. And tonight is one of those programs, particularly appropriate for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. We're hosting a conversation on AAPI Diversity and Unity with Karthick Ramakrishnan, a UC Riverside professor and one of the nation's premier experts on AAPI demographics, and Josie Huang, the Asian American Communities reporter for KPCC and LAist. We'd love this to be an interactive conversation, so please be sure to put all of your questions in the chat. We'll be getting to that later on in the program. And please mute your sound so that we can have a clear audio. And with that, Josie, take it away.
Okay, hi everybody. It's weird, I can't see anybody, but okay, I'll take it. I know you guys are there, but I'm really happy to be joining you all. I'm Josie Huang, as Teresa mentioned, and I work at KPCC. I've had different beats over the years, including immigration, housing, and religion, where I got to cover Asian American communities, but here I am full on back to covering AAPI communities full time. So quite a few times when I do stories, I've leaned on the data of AAPI Data, and I know many of you are very familiar already with Karthick and his work, but here's the formal intro. Karthick is a professor of public policy and political science at UC Riverside. He's also founding director of the school's Center for Social Innovation. He's carved out space as one of the country's leading voices on AAPI research and data, and has been quoted in thousands of news stories, some of which you have written. And he somehow finds time to publish numerous papers and has written 7 books. The most recent one is Citizenship Reimagined. Karthick also directs the National Asian American Survey and is the founder of AAPI Data. So geez, Karthick, I know we have a lot of questions for Karthick, especially after this past year, which has been both momentous and supremely dark at times for the AAPI communities. And Karthick will kick things off, I understand, with a presentation on some of the research he's been conducting recently. And I'll follow up with some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A. So welcome, Karthick, and please take it away.
Thank you, Josie. It's going to take me a second because I thought I'm on my iPad and I'm like trying to get a file that I'm opening through Google Slides, but it turns out that it's too large to open. If you just give me a minute.
Oh yeah, actually, I did have a question like while we're waiting for that to load, but sure. And this is so important, but given all your work obligations, research, and media appearances, I'm just curious, how much sleep do you get every night? Yeah. I'm just curious.
I manage now 6 hours of sleep a night. So, but sometimes it's less. I catch up on the weekends.
Okay.
So I'm sure, but you know, the thing is, as tough as I think I have it, I imagine that reporters, when they're writing on deadline, have much shorter time frames to work on things. So I don't imagine you get that much sleep either, Josie.
I don't, but it's not because I'm working. but no, reporters do have, I think that our kind of work is just, it's a little bit more frantic. I
might go off camera as I'm trying to pull it on my iPad, but continue asking if you don't mind. Just
oh yeah, not at all. And you'll just let me know when
yes.
I'm ready to go?
Yes, absolutely. I will.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that for me, it's been pretty much an onslaught of coverage of the same tenor. It's been, I imagine for a lot of you guys on this call, just some pretty dark stuff this year. So it's definitely taken a toll. I feel like it's affected my sleep, but for the most part, my lack of sleep is due to poor time management. So, yeah.
You know what? I am going to, just one second, and my apologies, folks. I'm like trying to see, this is a little bit of a challenge to figure out how I'm going to get this PowerPoint on my iPad. So just give me 1 minute, please.
Oh, not at all.
1 second. I'm just trying to see if I can download it. You know what I'll try, I'm gonna try to see if I can join from my computer, because it is on my computer. So
Yeah,
if someone sees me in the audience, they'll just need to make me a host again. So my apologies, folks, and I'll be.
no worries. I was thinking for everybody on the call, if you can start actually typing in your questions if you want here, because before we know it, it'll be time to load up questions on Karthick.
Okay, I am going to jump on my other computer. I'll be right back.
Okay, thank you, Baleen. You already have a question. Great. Okay. I do not know the answer to that. Wish I could talk to you guys. I don't know how to do that, right, Teresa?
Okay, are you able to see me and hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. I will share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you're able to see my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yes, now we can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me then just go to my slideshow. See, I have so many things open on my computer, so that's where I'm a little concerned. You're able to see the presentation, I hope?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, and my apologies for the technical difficulties. So I'll just say a little bit about API Data, which you may know already. So of course, we do a lot of data, but in the past few years, we're employing a framework that we came up with at the Center for Social Innovation, which quite simply we call DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. And we know that data is so important. We need systematic data to tell reliable stories about our communities. But data in and of itself, while it's important in terms of making a case for investments in our communities, either public investments or private investments, it's not sufficient. We need narratives, and this is where the work of journalists comes in. We need stories about our communities. We need the data to be meaningful. We need it to be memorable. And that's why narrative is so important. And then finally, often in addition to data and narrative, we need to think about strategic action. What are we trying to, who are we trying to persuade to do what? To pay more attention, to make more investments in our community and the like. So while I'm flattered when people when they think of Asian American or API Data, they think about us or they think about me. We need to go beyond just the data. API Data got started in 2013 in no small part because of a call from a journalist, actually. There was a journalist from The Economist who called me after the 2012 election. I'd been used to getting phone calls during election season in 2008 and in 2012 with the National Asian American Survey. But after the 2012 election was the first time I'd seen interest among journalists in covering Asian American populations after the election. So I saw the need to create a portal for Asian American and Pacific Islander data, as well as reliable reports that others had done on our communities. So that's how API Data got started. It started very simply as a portal to reports and some access to some quick census data. Since then, we've done our own original reports, either by ourselves or in partnership with many others, and you can find all of this on our website. Our team has grown. Initially started off just with me and Sono Shah, who is now at the Pew Research Center. He was a graduate student at UCR. Since then, we've added Jennifer Lee, Sarah Sadhwani, and Janelle Wong. These are all professors, and they are senior researchers at API Data. And then we have Sunny Shao and Mai Do, although Sunny is just now leaving us and also joining the Pew Research Center. So our graduate students go on to do great things in other places. We have different data tools, including community facts, where you can compare side by side different Asian American populations on some key population characteristics. We also have a feature called Quick Stats, where you can download sortable tables on key facts involving Asian American and Pacific Islander populations nationally, as well as by state, at the county level and congressional district level, and also by metropolitan area. A lot of the work we do involves infographics and blogging, and that's where we get a lot of our traction in the general public, but also often by journalists who don't have time to read detailed, complicated reports. So we create a lot of blog posts with infographics, even when we produce larger reports. One of the tools we created in 2020 was a mapping tool. We called it Census Maps. You can go to censusmaps.apidata.com, and you're able to generate these beautiful maps. One of the things I'll say about API Data is we care not only about the data, but data visualization. We believe that data can be beautiful. We also believe that data should be easily accessible. And this, I think, Teresa Watanabe from Asian American Journalists Association, LA, when she found out about these maps and the ability to really drill down and find detailed information about various populations, reached out to me and said that she found that tool so helpful in updating her understanding, for example, of the San Gabriel Valley, being able to drill deeper and knowing that there are significant Filipino and other populations. Of course, when we think about San Gabriel Valley, east of the city of LA, we think of the Chinese American population. But she pointed out that there were so many other populations, and it was just really helpful to be able to drill down like that. This is a map of Houston Metro, and similarly, there are different layers that you can turn on and off and find out various insights about the geographic spread of different Asian American as well as Pacific Islander populations. More generally, there are some key facts about AA and PI populations that are important to note. So we have been the fastest growing populations for a while now. It was true from 2000 to 2010, and also from 2010 to 2019. We're still waiting on the racial data to come out from the 2020 census, and those will be out until August of this year. Our population is not only growing, it's also diversifying. So many people still think of East Asians as the majority of the Asian American population, but they haven't been the majority for a while. And in fact, the most recent data, we just did a Medium blog post that's even more recent than 2016. You see that East Asians are just a little over a third of the Asian American population, and the South Asian population is at 28%, and Southeast Asian population is at 33%. Asian immigrants have outnumbered immigrants from Latin America since 2007, 2008. But the share of the foreign-born living in the United States, Latinos still outnumber Asian Americans in terms of the share of the foreign-born living in the United States. But that's expected to cross over by 2050, and that's according to estimates by the Pew Research Center. So what you have is a growing flow of Asian immigrants outnumbering Latinos into this country over a decade, but the stock of the foreign-born won't shift until 2050 or so. Other key facts that people should know about Asian American populations, I think given the audience, many probably know this, is the importance of detailed ethnicity data or disaggregated data. When you look at indicators like educational attainment, you see Taiwanese and Indian Americans at the top in terms of bachelor's degree or higher. And then you have various Southeast Asian refugee populations, including Hmong, Cambodian, and Bhutanese populations that have very low levels of educational attainment. Even within the Pacific Islander population, you see terms of data disaggregation, where you have Tongans at lower levels of educational attainment than Pacific Islanders. Generally, though, you'll notice that these numbers here that range from 11% to 19% is much lower than what you have for the Asian American average, or for those high level, high scoring groups, say among Indian and Taiwanese Americans. Now, there are other indicators like limited English proficiency. And here you'll see a group like Chinese Americans that is relatively high in terms of educational attainment, but relatively low in terms of English proficiency, or when you flip it, relatively high when it comes to needing language assistance. I'll say a little bit about voting. We just released a blog post which showed that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had the highest increases in voter turnout of any racial groups in the country. In fact, if you look at the absolute change, the increase is highest for Pacific Islanders, about 15 basis points, 15 percentage points of an increase from 2016 to 2020. Proportionally, it's about a third of an increase. For Asian Americans, it's about a fifth of an increase, and in absolute terms, it's about 11 percentage point increase from 2016 to 2020. We also saw record high levels of turnout among Asian Americans in 2018. A few reasons for that. Donald Trump was on the ballot in 2020. He wasn't on the ballot in 2018, but he was a very polarizing president and got a lot of people out, but especially Asian Americans. It's likely that the anti-immigrant rhetoric prior to COVID-19 and a lot of the rhetoric during COVID-19 also played a role. When you look at detailed origin, what we've found relatively consistently over time is that Indian Americans tend to have the highest rates of voting participation, whereas other groups tend to have much lower levels. Chinese Americans have tended to be at the bottom for as long as we've been measuring this. Now, some may be tempted to think that English proficiency plays a role, but note that Filipinos have relatively low levels of participation as well. And happy to talk about in the Q&A in terms of what might account for these differences. By the way, Indian Americans and Japanese Americans also tend to be among the most democratic leaning of the Asian American vote. We also saw big gains among young voters. So look at that population age 18 to 34. Only 41% of them voted in 2016, 56% of them voted in 2020. So you see a big jump in voting. You see a big jump in voting across all groups, but especially among younger voters, you see a disproportionately high increase. Another thing, given the journalist audience, I think it's important to note that when people cover the immigrant vote, they have to cover the Asian American population. So if you look nationally, this is in the 2020 current population survey data. If you look at registered voters who are foreign-born or naturalized US citizens, Asian Americans are about as large as Latinos if you look at the immigrant vote. And in California, Asian Americans are actually larger than Latinos when it comes to immigrants, when it comes to registered voters who are naturalized citizens. So I just say this, that, if you see headlines, if you see editors saying, I want you to cover the immigrant vote, you should tell them that Asian Americans, you need to cover Asian Americans as well as Latinos. Latino and immigrant is not interchangeable, particularly when it comes to voters. When it came to vote choice in 2020, this is from our pre-election survey, we found that Asian Americans were much more likely to support Biden over Trump. And we see differences by ethnicity, with Indian Americans showing the highest levels of support for Biden and Vietnamese Americans showing the highest levels of support for Trump. We didn't see in the way of party contact. This was in our pre-election survey. There have been some post-election surveys which have shown increases in contact, especially by Democrats to Asian American voters when it came closer to election day. Finally, given all of this diversity in the community, people might naturally ask, is there such a thing as an Asian American or an API agenda? And what's actually very interesting is that even though you find remarkable diversity on issues like poverty, on indicators like poverty, educational attainment, limited English proficiency, and the like, if I had to summarize public opinion data since 2008, when I've been involved in various survey efforts, as well as other surveys, there does seem to be an AAPI agenda under three broad categories. One is under the category of inclusion. So generally support for immigrant rights, generally support for language access. You see a lot of concern in terms of representation in entertainment, as well as representation in corporate leadership. That's not from our survey data. This is more generally where you see a fair amount of activism and interest among Asian American and Pacific Islander populations. Another broad category I would call protection. So Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders tend to be very strong supporters of gun control, much higher than the US average. Similarly, when it comes to environmental protection. So if you think about green voters, you should be thinking about Asian Americans as well. And then finally, in terms of healthcare, Asian Americans have been broadly supportive of expansions in healthcare coverage, including support for universal healthcare. And this is true even among Vietnamese Americans that tend to be Republican leaning. And then finally, third broad category, I would lump under opportunity in terms of educational opportunity, in terms of economic mobility, so support for the social safety net, support for higher taxes, and then financial security. In a few surveys where we've asked questions about concerns about debt, concerns about credit card debt, concerns about healthcare debt, concerns about financial fraud, especially among elders, those concerns are relatively high. I'll say a little bit about education because there have been a fair amount of news coverage before COVID hit. If you looked at the most frequent news coverage about Asian Americans, it was about the Harvard lawsuit and affirmative action. And so people might think that affirmative action is a very salient issue for Asian Americans. It never really registers as a top issue, but we do have questions about affirmative action that we've asked. We've also asked about other questions about affordability of education, and that's a significant concern. Access to good public education, as well as the quality of education. These are all important concerns. By the way, bullying in schools is also a significant concern for Asian Americans if you think about education. And yet, there's a lot of media interest in affirmative action, and we're happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But it's important to realize that most Asian Americans do not attend elite universities. So if you look in California, for example, a lot of news coverage about Asian American admissions to Berkeley and UCLA. Most Asian Americans in the higher ed system in California attend community college. And you have about as many Asian Americans attending the Cal States as the UCs. So that's just really important to keep in mind that if we're thinking about Asian Americans in higher education, the UCs and especially Berkeley and UCLA, it's a very small share of Asian Americans in higher ed. If you look at support for affirmative action, unlike some of the media coverage which might suggest that Asian Americans either oppose affirmative action or are split on affirmative action, Asian Americans actually support affirmative action. The Chinese American population, the way we've asked this survey, there has been some fluctuation over time. And it's hard to tell how much of that is just part of the random draw of when you do survey research or persuasion tactics within the Chinese American population. And you have seen an increase in progressive organization efforts to try to persuade Asian American communities and the Chinese American community in particular. Of course, in the last year, COVID-19, as well as other issues involving the racialization of Asian Americans has come to the fore politically. And so that might make a difference moving into the future in terms of Asian American voter turnout. We're already seeing some evidence of that in the 2020 elections, but heading into 2022 and 2024. Let's say a little bit about a survey that we did with SurveyMonkey. This is in itself is a very interesting story. We were able to move very quickly because of a personal connection. I know the chief research officer at SurveyMonkey, John Cohen. So the day after the Atlanta killings, I was speaking with Janelle Wong, who's a senior researcher at AAPI Data and a longstanding friend and colleague of mine. And we talked about how, we needed better data, more systematic data on experiences with hate incidents. Community hotlines like Stop AAPI Hate are important in collecting this data, but the numbers just seemed too low to us. Back then it was about 4,000 incidents that have been reported. And so we decided to do this survey, and I emailed John Cohen within 40 minutes of emailing him. This is on the morning after the Atlanta killings. He said that they were ready to help, and they did it all. I mean, we didn't pay a penny for this. So we did a survey that included not only Asian Americans, but also Pacific Islanders, as well as other racial groups. And so from our estimates in 2020 and 2021, our estimates are upwards of 2 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced these hate incidents. But what's also important to note is that other racial groups have also experienced hate incidents, and that Black people in the United States actually have had a higher incidence of hate crimes. And this is the wording: have you ever had someone verbally or physically abuse you or damage your property specifically because of your race or ethnicity? So it's important to keep that context and perspective in mind. Now, there are other microaggressions that Asian Americans are more likely to face than other racial groups. So this perpetual foreigner status, I wouldn't call it a hate incident per se. I think that what is important, I think it's important to keep in context, hate incidents than, as opposed to microaggressions like being asked where you're from. This is not to minimize the importance of these incidents, because as they accumulate over time, it does create the sense of othering. But there are other kinds of experiences and stereotypes that are important to also flag. So in that same SurveyMonkey, in that same survey that we did with SurveyMonkey, we asked, have people acted as if they're afraid of you? And here we see that, and by the way, this survey was conducted in March, right? We see that Asian Americans score much lower on this than Black people, and also Pacific Islanders. So, we don't often see survey data in terms of stereotypes of Pacific Islanders. And we see that Pacific Islanders say that yes to this question of, have people acted as if they're afraid of you? We also ask questions like, have you ever been unfairly stopped, searched, questioned, physically threatened, or abused by the police? And here we see that Black people in the United States, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders are much more likely to say yes to this than Asian Americans. So again, this is not to do any kind of oppression Olympics here, but if we just need to keep in mind that racism works in different ways, and different populations experience racism in different ways. And when it comes to being unfairly stopped and searched or threatened or abused by the police, it is very clear that Black people in the United States are much more likely to encounter this than Asian Americans. And ditto for experiencing poor service at restaurants, right? And I just say this because if so much of, at least I'll say from personal experience, I see so much on social media in which people share these viral incidents of people being yelled at or being treated rudely in restaurants. Black people experience that a lot more than Asian Americans do, and it's just important to have that context in mind. Within the Asian American community, it's also, when you look at systematic survey data, both in terms of the kind of reports that are shared or those that are reported to community hotlines, that's like Stop API Hate, you have something like a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio of women more likely than men reporting that. We also saw a recent study from University of Michigan in terms of news coverage, finding a 2-to-1 ratio of women, Asian women, more likely to be reported in terms of hate crime coverage than men. It's important to not mistake that to say that women are more likely to experience hate incidents than men. In fact, what we find is that Asian American men are more likely to say yes to have experienced hate crimes. Similarly, the native born more so than the foreign born. That's not what we see in terms of some of the more viral incidents that have been shared. And then look at that, young Asian Americans are about as likely as seniors to say that they've been a victim of a hate crime. And this makes sense, right? I mean, if you're talking about young people that are more likely to be out and about, or men that may be more likely to get into physical altercations, it's just important for us to look at the survey data in the context of other data. Now, it's also the case that when it comes to reporting hate crimes, Women are less likely than men to say that they're very comfortable doing so. And seniors are much less likely than those 18 to 34 to say that they're comfortable reporting hate crimes. So I'll leave it at that. I've shared a lot of data with you, but I would encourage you to look at that survey that we did with SurveyMonkey, because a lot of those findings would be different from what you would expect, either given mainstream news coverage or even what you see shared on social media. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot that I've shared with you. Happy to entertain any questions.
Okay. So folks have already posted a bunch of really great questions, and I can see them being organized into different batches, including these, what you were just talking about with anti-Asian attacks, as well as politics and demographic change. So just because you were just getting done speaking about your survey, the collaboration with SurveyMonkey, I'll just start off. I think what I'm going to do, actually, because there's so many good questions here, is just start tossing some of these questions at you, interweave any kind of follow-up questions I might have. But yeah, so as you were mentioning, Stop AAPI Hate has reported there's been 6,600 incidents of anti-Asian attacks and incidents. These are, of course, self-reports, right? So I think that's why it's kind of limited in terms of the scope. And I think everyone, including the folks at Stop AAPI Hate, would say that's just the tip of the iceberg. But could you talk about, when you worked on this with SurveyMonkey, were you expecting to find that 10% of Asian Americans and about maybe almost that amount of Pacific Islander adults had experienced hate crimes and hate incidents in just 2021, right?
Yes, yeah. So that was just in the first few months of this year. Yeah, I didn't know what to expect, right? And so, that's for us, we actually want to go in not expecting anything in terms of what the data will tell us, and to see where the data take us. And that sometimes gets us into trouble, right? Because, for example, when our pre-election survey indicated that Vietnamese Americans were more likely to support Trump than Biden, and some folks, it was kind of like arguing with the ref, like they weren't happy with that finding, and there were some election eve polls that suggested that Biden had won the Vietnamese American vote. But since then, when we've seen precinct level analysis, especially coming out of Orange County and even the San Jose metro area and other Vietnamese heavy areas around the country, I think our data are closer to what likely happened. There is uncertainty, right? So we don't have as many surveys of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders the way we do of the general population or the white population, right? So we couldn't do a kind of Nate Silver like 538 aggregation of all these surveys and say that this is the average estimate. So I am always humble and cautious about not reading too much into our surveys, but we do approach these things with that joy of discovery, right? We don't already know what's going to happen, but it is alarming in terms of the proportion that have experienced it. But I would also say, let's pay attention to hate crimes and hate incidents that Black people have faced and others have faced too. I think that what it shows is, especially white America, or maybe just America in general, but even Asian Americans who somehow thought that they were either white adjacent or somehow absent from the race conversation in America, like that was a rude awakening. What COVID has shown us is that we can flip from being a model minority to the forever foreigner in an instant. And of course, South Asians knew that after 9/11. East Asians didn't experience it in the same way. And now it's, what happens is different kinds of international incidents, as it were, even though the coronavirus was not an international incident, although it did originate in China. So the kind of news coverage of that created this dynamic where a particular segment of our population was seen as the carrier of that disease, just like brown Asians were seen as terrorist threats post 9/11, and you had a lot of violence And so that there's a recent Medium, I'm sorry, Josie, I'm just kind of going off here a little bit, but there's a recent Medium piece that Jennifer Lee and I wrote where it is really inspiring to see the kind of social movement activity happening now in the Asian American community. But we didn't see that in quite the same way in the post 9/11 period or after the mass killings in Oak Creek. And we highlight that to say that, and even when Filipinos have gotten killed, for example, right? So it's just really important, especially given the diversity of our community, for to consistently show up for each other. And I'll give a shout out to someone like Manju Kulkarni, who is the executive director of AppCon and one of the co-founders of the Stop API Hate. I find it so powerful to have a South Asian woman as one of the leaders in this moment, who is not only decrying, but doing something about making sure that our community's stories are being elevated and that people are paying attention. Now, that figure now it's 6,000 is much lower than 2 million, but it's much higher than the number who have reported these incidents to law enforcement authorities. So it's still so important to have community hotlines, but even those hotlines, we need to increase their capacity and make sure that people understand, that resources like that are available to them. Now that's a website. We need to have phone hotlines that people can call, or maybe apps that people can use to be able to report these things with more frequency.
But I do really appreciate that there is more than one repository of this information out there. Aside from Stop API Hate, there's you guys. For instance, it's been reported by the media often that women are, based on the self-reports to Stop API Hate, are being, it would appear from their reports, attacked more. But what your data through SurveyMonkey is finding that no, is gender. The racism does not segregate by gender or by age.
Absolutely. So that's the thing. I think we need to be very precise, right? So I think what we can say is women are more likely than men to have reported it to these community hotlines. That is an accurate statement. But you cannot say that women are more likely to have experienced it than men. And even in our survey, right? This is a survey in which someone said yes. So someone experiences an incident and then they have to interpret it as a hate incident. And then this is a self-administered survey in which people that, are part of the SurveyMonkey data kind of panel, as well as other panels who take these surveys, were presented that question. And so they answered that question. So it's a self-administered online survey. We think people are likely more comfortable saying yes in that than say if it was a telephone survey, someone called them up and asked them, and they're talking to a live human being. And the barriers are even higher, in which you have to go to a website and register a complaint, right? That's why you see a major drop from the numbers that likely have experienced it to have reported it. And it seems like women are more likely to go report to community hotlines like Stop API Hate than men. Mm-hmm. And there's all sorts of reasons, right? I mean, men, just for whatever reason, may not feel compelled or empowered, moved to fill out that information.
Yeah, there's so many different complicating factors. It's about who knows that Stop API Hate exists as a website that you can go fill out forms to. And also in terms of self-reporting, I think, Stop API Hate will always, it's not like, the legal system that is looking for a certain standard of what is a racist incident or a hate crime or not. It's what you thought happened as was an act of racism. So yeah, so there's
it's complex, but I would say it is so important that resources like that exist, because without that, so we need different kinds of data collections, but we also need to understand the limitations of each and the strengths of each.
Yeah, and just I wanted to go back to something you were saying about just the reaction or this response the API community has had to different hate crimes. There was such outcry after the Atlanta shootings, but shortly after there was the Indianapolis FedEx shootings, where there were 4 Sikh Americans who were killed amongst 8, I think.
That's right.
And, if we were just to look at social media, there just wasn't the same outcry you saw around the Atlanta shootings. And, just going back into history, everyone, a lot of people would recognize the name Vincent Chin, but in 2017, there was an Indian immigrant in, I think it was Kansas City.
Srinivas Kuchibhotla. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
And
no, absolutely. No, this is there's a lot of work to do in terms of representation, and so just recently, Nancy Wang Yun, I believe that's how you pronounce her name, released a study in terms of Asian representation in Hollywood. First of all, it's very low, but among the Asian who are represented, East Asians are something like over 60% of those represented, even though they're only 36% now of the Asian American population, right? So we need to do better in terms of making sure that we represent the diversity of Asian American. By the way, one factoid that might help folks in terms of thinking about how Asian America has changed. In 2019, for the first time, Indian Americans outnumbered Chinese Americans as the largest single origin Asian group.
Yeah, I was going to
ask. That's huge.
Right. I think, in fact, I was looking at a map from Pew that showed more states than Chinese Americans. Indian Americans were the dominant
right.
American group by population, and that they're growing at the fastest rate. And that's actually something I wanted to ask you about. What's leading to this fast population growth amongst Indian Americans? And are you saying that they've already become, they're still not the largest Asian American group at this point, are they?
If you look at single origin, right? So it's looking at Asian alone as opposed to multiracial Asian. So if you look at Asian Americans, like myself, I'm an immigrant, but I identify only as Asian and not as any other racial group. There are more Indians than Chinese. That is a big deal. Like, that is huge. And I don't think, so that, but in terms of our perception of who counts as Asian, so Jennifer Lee and I have an article where we use survey data and we look at people's perception of different groups and how likely they say that they are Asian. And Indian Americans and Pakistani Americans are much less likely to be thought of as Asian than East Asian. Still, it's the historical pattern of Chinese and Japanese immigration from the 1800s that are still dominant in our thinking in terms of who is Asian American. But hopefully this is where I think reporters can play a role. Of course, arts and entertainment plays an important role as well in terms of updating our perceptions of who the Asian American population is in this country. In terms of why is this growth happening? South Asians more generally are the fastest growing group. So you have Bangladeshi Americans start off with a smaller baseline, but they're having significant growth. For the Indian American population, a lot of it is with these temporary immigrant populations. So students and also temporary, like H-1B visa workers. So India is the largest origin country for the H-1B visa program. Eventually, many of them end up getting their green cards. That's on Twitter, I whenever I do put out things about the Asian American community, I almost inevitably get a tweet at someone saying, you need to pay attention to the people with these enormous backlogs waiting for their green cards. Why aren't you paying more attention to that issue? So the H-1B population is significant, and that's a big part of the Indian origin population, at least the Indian immigrant population in the United States today.
So Karthik, just going back to the line of questioning about the hate incidents, Weijia asks, President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law this week, but to your point, many advocacy groups say it doesn't go far enough to include other marginalized groups. What more can legislation and administration do?
It's part of what needs to happen is greater resourcing of community organizations that serve Asian American Pacific Islander populations, and then also, LGBT communities within the API population, for example, right? We need to think about intersectionality, and we also need to think about places where there may not be a strong and robust Asian American or Pacific Islander community, at least a nonprofit infrastructure, right? So we need to be thinking about many of these states where the populations are smaller, they're fast growing, but they don't have the resources to be able to support the communities. The thing I should say when we think about Asian Americans and COVID, we also need to think beyond just these hate incidents. So people may or may not know that unemployment spiked very high among the Asian American population, as with other groups. But unlike prior recessions where the unemployment rate for Asian Americans did not go as high, it did this time around. And the Vietnamese American population, I mean, it had very high rates of unemployment because Vietnamese are disproportionately represented in personal services, right? Nail salons especially. But you didn't see many stories about that. When you looked at COVID-19 deaths, Pacific Islanders, disproportionately high death rate. You didn't see as much news reporting as we should have. You also saw, at least based on data that was put out by nursing associations, that Filipino nurses were disproportionately represented among the deaths among nurses. And yet you saw one or two stories about it. So I'm just pointing out all of this so that we have a more fuller portrait of how COVID-19 has affected our communities. We also put out data. We had a COVID-19 data piece based on the Marshall Project, and they looked not at cause of death, but disproportionate death rates, right? So that's one of the ways that public health experts try to estimate what the number of COVID-19 deaths is not COVID-19 as the direct cause of death, but looking at how much higher the death rate was in a given week compared to the prior 5-year average. And the CDC puts out that data. And from a few months ago, when we looked at this, there were many states where the Asian American death rate was disproportionately higher than the white death rate. But no one was talking about Asian American deaths due to COVID. I mean, it was also disproportionately high for Latinos and Black residents as well. So I'm hopeful that it is great that our community is getting a lot of attention, but hopefully people will pay attention to our communities after COVID and beyond issues connected with hate incidents.
Yeah, speaking to the death rate, I think there was a lot of understanding amongst reporters who follow the Asian American community that there probably was disproportionate amounts of deaths in certain AAPI communities, more so than others. Of course, we don't have the disaggregated data, and when you ask public health departments about it, and they say they're just so overtaxed, don't have the resources. I mean, what any suggestions for how we can ever going to get this data? Really going to know what happened during the pandemic in terms of understanding what happened to the Asian American communities and who died.
It's I think the closest we can get is from that existing kind of disproportionate death data, and even then, these data are not disaggregated, unfortunately, right? And so there was actually a bill, AB 1726, and one of my roles, in addition to being a professor and the founder and director of AAPI Data, I chair the California Commission on API Affairs. I was on the commission when we advocated for data disaggregation, and we were able to get it in healthcare. Unfortunately, there was some mobilization in the community that opposed data disaggregation on education data. And I'm hopeful that we can fight for that again, because it's just ridiculous. We do need to have data disaggregation on all sorts of administrative data, including in education, right? We don't know, for example, in our various community colleges, you saw that the majority of Asian Americans are in community colleges. For most of these community colleges, we don't know, which ones have high Hmong populations, which ones have high Cambodian populations, which ones have high Korean we just don't know, because many of them do not collect that detailed data, or if they collect them, they don't share them. It's a major equity issue. That said, we were able to get health administrative data was supposed to be disaggregated. This bill was passed in 2016, but health agencies have until 2022 to collect that data. And most places did not upgrade their systems to be able to collect disaggregated Asian American data. I'm hopeful that, for future, health crises, that we will have better data, at least in California. But most counties in the U.S. do not disaggregate Asian American data when it comes to collecting all sorts of diseases or causes of death.
Karthik, if we could just back up to, you were talking about AB, I think it's 1726, the state bill. Teresa had a question about what was the rationale against data disaggregation in education, who was opposed. This had to do with affirmative action, right?
Well, it had nothing to do with affirmative action, but that was the distorted message that was getting put out, right? So yeah, so Jerry Brown had 726. I mean, it was just a fast. I mean, there needs to be a story written on this, even if it's like from so many years ago. AB 726 was about education, and then Jerry Brown vetoed it on some very bad advice. And essentially his veto message saying that, we need to unite we need to have a united Asian American community, and we don't want to create things that divides us. First of all, it's just kind of strange when you had Asian American advocates pushing for this, and to have a white governor somehow deciding what was better for the community. That was strange. And so this bill came back, and you had some conservatives who basically said, this is a way to bring back affirmative action in California, even though collecting detailed data about the Asian American community has nothing to do with affirmative action. They said that this is basically trying to bring affirmative action through the back door. There was a lot of wild-eyed rhetoric. Some people said that by collecting this data, you will create a new Chinese Exclusion Act, or that you will get, basically they said by collecting data on Japanese Americans, they were able to intern Japanese Americans, and therefore by collecting detailed data on Asian Americans today, you could do similar things to them. We have all sorts of civil rights protections that prevent against that, but that was the rhetoric that was used. The opposition was mostly coming from Chinese immigrants, and it was about affirmative action. It was about admission to UCs, but UCs already collect this data and they report this data. That bill would have done nothing to the collection and dissemination of data from the UC system. But there was a lot of misinformation, especially using online forums like in WeChat and microblogs to mobilize the Chinese American community against that issue. And you had many elected officials that their phones were ringing and people were, just intimidating them to say that you cannot pass a bill that disaggregates education data. It was really, really unfortunate and sad. I wish our elected officials, including our API elected, there are no PI elected officials at the state level in California. Our Asian American elected officials have more courage to be able to push data disaggregation bills in the future.
Well, speaking of politicians, I do want to make sure we have some time to talk about, get some questions in about politics here. And there's another question I saw from Wade Jassett in which she asked, in your research about the AAPI data voter turnout, did you learn why it surged? What was the most common reason people who did not previously vote decide to during this election?
So in terms of our survey data, prior to that, even though outreach had not been as high as for other racial groups, Asian Americans were more likely to live in congressional districts and in states that were competitive this year than in prior years. So that's part of the reason why you've seen an increase. You also saw an increase. I mean, Trump has increased interest in, but he increased interest in politics across the board, including among low propensity voters. But that said, yes, you still have about 40% of Asian Americans who did not vote. This has been a persistent puzzle, right? Asian Americans on average, tend to have higher levels of education than others. Our voting research suggests that those who have higher education, higher income tend to vote more. So why don't Asian Americans vote as high as you would expect a college graduate to vote? It's because most Asian Americans, the majority of Asian American voters are, or Asian American adult citizens are naturalized citizens. They're foreign born. So they didn't grow up in a Republican household or a Democratic household. Most of them, if they went to college, did not go to college in the United States. These are the venues where people become politically socialized. So it takes a longer time for someone who's naturalized, even if they have a college degree, to get engaged in the political process. Now, political parties and campaigns can accelerate that process by reaching out to them, but that's been relatively slow in coming. It is increasing, and I think it becomes a kind of virtuous circle. As people see that Asian Americans are more likely to vote, they're more likely to invest in Asian American outreach, and we're starting to see signs of that finally.
Mm-hmm. You were mentioning Asian American electorate, or we are a largely or majority immigrant population. Is that right? So,
Yeah.
And many are naturalized, but I imagine there's also many who are green card holders still, and some who are undocumented. Do you think that is also a significant reason for our voter turnout numbers?
Oh, but that, I should say those voter turnout numbers are among adult citizens. So yes, if you looked at the more general population, Asian voters divided by the Asian population would be much smaller than what we see. I'm glad you brought up the issue of undocumented Asians. So this is a community that still is relatively invisible, right? I mean, so Asian Americans among the undocumented Asian Americans have been the fastest growing since 2000. But we don't see that many stories about Asian undocumented. And again, this actually ends up being a kind of vicious circle where you don't see that many stories about it. There's a kind of stigma within many Asian American populations, especially in the Chinese American, but even in the Indian American community, people don't talk about it as much. But you have significant undocumented populations among the Indian, Filipino, and Chinese communities. And if you look back at DACA, Chinese Americans, even though, the estimates of the Chinese immigrant population that was eligible for DACA was relatively significant in the Asian American community, very few of them took on DACA. Korean Americans were actually more likely than other Asian groups to apply for DACA. Part of that is because you have a stronger social movement within the Korean immigrant population, where being undocumented is not seen as much of it's not as taboo, right, to come out as undocumented in the Korean American community as in the Chinese immigrant or the Indian immigrant community.
That's right. If I remember correctly, and someone can tell me if I'm wrong, I think the first DACA recipient was Korean, is Korean.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't realize that.
I've seen that at some point. I think you mentioned earlier that, Asian American voters helped secure Biden the White House, and that a lot of it had to do with the first time, second gen Asian American voters. Is that right?
Well, I mean, you did see a big increase. Now, I would say if, what is that expression, like victory has many fathers, right, from Winston Churchill. So there are many groups that were responsible for Biden's victory, and top among them were Black voters, right? I mean, so Black turnout. And by the way, same was true for Obama in 2008 and 2012. We are accustomed to thinking of Obama as a president that won support across the board. And it's true that he won the Asian American vote, the Latino vote, the Black vote. He did not win the white vote. Democrats have not won the white vote for decades. But Obama would not have been in the White House were it not for Black turnout. It's just fundamentally the case, right? And similarly, Biden would not have won the White House without Black turnout. Now, it also is true that if Latino voters had stayed at home and Asian American voters had stayed at home, he would have lost the White House too. So all of these groups matter. And it was in particular states. I mean, what's interesting, in places like Georgia, right? Asian Americans are not that large in terms of the electorate, but big enough to have made a difference. And the Asian American community is growing disproportionately fast in states like Georgia, states like North Carolina. I would say watch out for North Carolina. That's going to be interesting in 2022 for the Senate race, and in 2024 for the presidential race. These are places that are diversifying and that are also becoming more politically competitive. These are also states where the legislatures and the governors that are state houses that are controlled by Republicans are trying to make it more difficult to vote, fearing that demographic future where they may no longer have a dominant grip in the legislature. You saw that in Arizona. You're seeing that in Georgia. You're seeing that in places like North Carolina. Oh, Josie, did you freeze for a second there?
Yes, I did freeze for a second. I apologize. I'm back. That's right. So, I noticed that I missed a little bit about what you said, but in terms of Georgia, I see that B. Wynn, who is a state legislator, is making a run for Secretary of State. So given what you know about Georgia's demographics, do you think she has a shot?
One other thing that's important to know for Asian American elected officials, when you look at Asian American members of Congress, for example, there are very few congressional districts that are majority Asian, right? In fact, you have congressional districts in Hawaii, and you have a couple of districts in California that are either majority Asian or close to majority Asian. So most Asian Americans have to win office by winning the support of non-Asians. This is unlike Black members of Congress, that most of them live in Black majority districts. Similarly, Latino members of Congress, most of them live in Latino majority districts. So, B and others, when they run for statewide office, especially, but even for congressional office, they have to build coalitions. Sometimes it's coalitions with Latino voters and Black voters, but often it's coalitions with white voters. Just by dint of our demographics, there are very few congressional districts where we are in a numerical majority. Oh, you're muted, Josie.
Sorry. I hate it when people do that. I just did that. Okay. So, that reminds me, I had seen some numbers from the Reflective Democracy campaign. They did a report that showed AAPIs make up less than 1% of elected leaders. And I guess that was a little bit surprising to me, but it's just because we're in California, where we do have a good number of Asian Americans who are in the state and some in federal office. And so based on, you've been doing this for—
Okay, but one thing I'll say on that, at least the last time I had looked at the data, when you look at Asian American members of Congress, their share of members of Congress is about on par as their share of voters. So the gap is not as high when you look at members of Congress. But when you look at other offices, yes. But part of that is also the supply of candidates as much as, say, the demand for candidates, right? What we have seen over time is that more and more people are running for office, but you need to have this, this is kind of among families, I'll just say this, like sometimes when Asian Americans decide to run for office, the first office they decide to run for is Congress. And it's like, no, like how about running for school board first, or like city council first, right? Try for some of these other offices. And there are some powerful examples, right? Like in Philadelphia, right? In terms of, winning school board and then running for city council and then running for mayor, for example. Similarly, in Boston, and you have in other places where people have gone that path. So I'm hopeful that with prominent examples like Kamala Harris, like Tammy Duckworth, right? Like Pramila Jayapal, from Washington State, people who have broken not only racial barriers, but race and gender barriers in running for office, that you'll see more Asian Americans and especially Asian American women running for office. If you look at California, I love the members of the California API Legislative Caucus, but at least on the Democratic side, they're all men, right? We need many more, and to be fair, they are supporting efforts to get more Asian American women, to recruit them to run for office. But we still have a long ways to go.
Teresa has a question related to this. What can AAPIs do to increase representation in high-level political government jobs? There's a lot of discontent that there are no AAPI cabinet secretaries in the Biden administration. Among the UC regents, there is only one appointed AAPI regent, despite Asian Americans being the largest group of students.
Yeah, so it's the answer is multifaceted. I think part of it is more collective action. So I think, first of all, collecting this data, but I'll just go back to that data narrative action framework, right? We have the data, but then what do we do about it? What kind of narratives, what kind of stories will we tell? And then what is going to be the kind of collective action? Now, it's really interesting to think of that notion of reflective democracy, because in political science, we have two different types of representation, what they call descriptive representation and substantive representation. Descriptive representation is, do you have a candidate who looks like you by race, by gender, and whatever other attribute? Substantive representation is, are your interests being represented, right? And the two are not the same. So you could have someone who doesn't look like you who is advocating for your interests. On the flip side, you could have someone who looks like you, but who does not reflect, the positions of your community. So, for South Asians, Bobby Jindal would be the quintessential example. Bobby Jindal's preferences, or Nikki Haley's preferences, is way out of the median or mainstream of where Indian Americans vote and where their opinions lie, right? And so that's important to keep in mind. So I say that because I don't think it should just be a kind of bean counting exercise or a face counting exercise in terms of who are the UC regions and do they represent Asian Americans. But there is a lot more advocacy that can and should be done. Being appointed to the regions is a political, it's a political decision made by the governor, right? And so largely, there are some other regions that appear in other ways. So there has to be a lot more advocacy. But my question would be, what would the agenda be? How are Asian Americans not being represented in the UC system right now? And there have been great reports, for example, by the Campaign for College Opportunity, in terms of how racial diversity gets worse in these higher education systems when you go from the student population to the tenured professoriate to the administrator population. And this is true across various systems of higher education. And it's true for Asian Americans as it is for others. The thing I would say is that when we argue for greater representation and greater justice, that we should be advocating for all communities of color and not just Asian American communities. It's just, it's important to play coalitional politics because that's the only way things get done. Especially in California, where you have no group that's a numerical majority, Asian Americans are not going to get what they want and their interests addressed if they are not also supporting what Latino populations want and what Black populations want and their elected officials. So that's something I would say when it came to the affirmative action debate in 2014, and there was so much opposition that was coming out of the Asian American, especially the Chinese American population, I thought that was incredibly short-sighted. Because if we are not supporting policies that other groups support, they are less likely to support the policies that we want, right? And so it's really important for us to be part of coalitions and also to fight for racial justice more generally than just kind of have a narrow view of what our community's interests are.
I want to ask you a question about affirmative action, but you made me think about this whole issue of substantive versus representational or
descriptive.
You could see that in this past election over in the district that in Orange County that Michelle Steele won, where the Democrat Harley Ruda actually got a lot of support, I understand, from second-gen Vietnamese Americans who did not necessarily see another Asian American representing their interests. And just, I want to go back to, you were saying something about the Vietnamese American electorate and how, was it your surveys or?
Our survey found that, they're more likely to say that they would vote for Trump. And, so the older Vietnamese American population is more Republican. No, the thing is, Obama, in our surveys, Obama and even Clinton won the Vietnamese American vote. We find that Trump gained support among Vietnamese American voters. Some of that is by painting Joe Biden as a socialist, and it wasn't just in terms of mainstream media. It was through, WhatsApp and WeChat and other venues that are less like, they're through various social media and even community radio, where you had these allegations of Biden being a socialist, kind of activating that. Also, the anti-China rhetoric, Trump did lose support among Chinese American voters between 2016 and 2020. But he gained among Vietnamese American voters. He gained among Indian American voters too, although he lost the Indian American vote and by the biggest margin of any Asian group, he still made some inroads. And especially in our survey, it seems like he made inroads among Indian American men and those naturalized citizens, Indian American men.
You've been referencing WeChat and WhatsApp. As someone who's pretty illiterate in Chinese, how do you know what's going on those apps?
So, Sunny Xiao, who's just about to defend her dissertation and start at Pew Research Center, her dissertation, she is, she's a Chinese immigrant, and, her dissertation was looking at Asian American or Chinese immigrant, Chinese American political activism on the WeChat platform. And so, through her, I got to learn quite a bit about public accounts, about these, these private groups that you have to get invited into. So Chinese Americans for Trump, for example, is a private group, and also microblogs. So so I have to give all credit to Sunny, because yes, I am not bilingual.
What are you going to do when Sunny leaves?
I know we need to recruit. Well, yeah, for that particular piece, for AAPI Data, we're kind of in an interesting place. We're very likely going to enter into what I call an API Data 2.0, where when we started API Data, there was no other group in the country doing this. And so we thought of ourselves, our internal code was like we were a virtual think tank, but we never called ourselves that. I think by now we've kind of become that, but we need more resources and we need to staff up more. And we have had funders who are shocked at how much we are able to do with so little. So I think, at least I'm hopeful that our future will mean more funding and more capacity to kind of build more robust tools and also to have more staffing to do this work.
I just want to remind the audience, we've got about 10 more minutes. So please, if you have any more questions for Karthik, stick them in there. In the meantime, Karthik, I did want to ask you about affirmative action, because I feel like I've seen findings from AAPI Data and other organizations that indicate Asian Americans, in general, or the majority, do support affirmative action. But I've also seen, I think it was Pew, had a study which indicated that all demographics in the US do not think race should be a factor in college admissions. And I'm just wondering if this is just any kind of discrepancy or a divergence on this topic. It has to do with just how the question is being framed to the survey respondents.
Yeah, so the way the question is asked absolutely makes a difference. The way we asked the question the same way over time, and it was based on a much earlier Pew survey, I think from like 2006 or so, right? And so we wanted a time series, and so we've been asking it in that consistent way. I should also note that public opinion in general is not the same as mobilized opinion. So to put it another way, the loudest voices in the room do not necessarily represent all the opinions in the room. But this is not to say that we should both matter. You should know what all the opinions in the room are, but the loudest opinions in the room, if they end up making a difference in terms of shaping narrative or sometimes even affecting policy, right? In 2014, for example, there was so much mobilization that, what was it? ACA 5? Yeah, ACA 5 was rejected because of the mobilization of anti-affirmative action groups. Now that didn't happen in 2020. SCA 5 passed, but then it got defeated at the ballot box, in Prop 16. And it's likely that, I mean, affirmative action is a really tough issue, not just among Asian American voters. And I'll say this, maybe personally too. So I teach at University of California, Riverside. And I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, I was in my class on California politics, I was talking about affirmative action, and a student raised her hand. And I was talking about how, affirmative action got defeated with Prop 209. Student raised her hand and she said, I'm sorry, what is affirmative action? And I was like, wow. And I had to kind of hide my shock. But, you have an entire generation in California that does not know what affirmative action is. Right. And so that's something I think that's when we think about affirmative action, it's either us Asian Americans are more likely to know it because it's a salient issue in our communities, or, we're old. And so we remember when affirmative action existed in California.
And of course, you were talking about how affirmative action went down the ballot box at Prop 16. And so we know, of course, it's not only Asian Americans deciding that issue, even though the focus is often on, how are Asian Americans standing? Where do they stand on it? But if you look at surveys, it indicates other groups.
Yeah, even the Latino population looked like it was split. The thing is, it was a tough year. There were so many other issues on the ballot in California. I know we have journalists tuning in from outside of California too, but you had major ballot propositions with hundreds of millions of dollars that were being poured in. And so you didn't have the same kind of voter education, with that in isolation. That's something that's important to keep in mind. When you look at public opinion, you have to see it in context, not only in that issue, but also in the raft of other issues that people are weighing when they're voting for a candidate, or even deciding, what kind of issues they're going to pay attention to at the ballot box with direct democracy.
Right. For folks outside of California, I think a lot of the media's attention, a lot of the money was going towards a proposition about the gig economy and gig workers. So a good question to end things on is from Teresa, and that's, what stories, Karthik, do you think the API community, about the API community, should us journalists be doing that we're not doing?
Okay. This is great, right? I can put out my wish list. So one, I would say about undocumented Asian Americans. I think that story, those communities, their stories have not been told as much. Pacific Islanders, it's important to say more. So we did, the James Irvine Foundation commissioned a survey of working Californians who are Asian American and Pacific Islander. So when it came to the gig economy, Pacific Islanders are disproportionately represented in the gig economy. With COVID too, disproportionately affected their communities. Teresa, what I would say on some of these, it'll be more specific to particular communities. In terms of, I think LGBT populations, we are as complex a population as any other. I would say environmental issues. This is something. Environmental issues and gun control, these are things consistently we've seen very strong opinion, supporting environmental protection and supporting gun control. I would doubt that if there's an environmental beat reporter, I wonder how many Asian Americans they've quoted in their stories, right? So this is something I would say is that, yes, issues like immigration, yes, issues like language access, yes, issues like education matter for Asian American communities, but so do other issues. So I would say, when you talk to your colleagues that are covering the environment, that are covering taxes, that are, Asian Americans are approaching 1 out of every 6 Californians. We need to make sure that Asian American voices are being included on these other issues. As with other communities, Latinos as the largest population in California, we need to make sure that when you're sourcing, materials, when you're sourcing, for stories, that you're getting the diversity of California, of the country, in terms of who is seen as either an expert or who is seen as quote unquote the community voice.
And with just a few minutes left, there was a question I did want to get to. I think all of us would love for just the raft in violence and attacks, or just hate towards Asian Americans to abate so we can get to covering some of these stories that you've been talking about. But there was a question early on where someone, let's see, was asking about how you are able to stay, not the word upbeat, or how do you keep yourself energized with the darkness that surfaces? You have to think a lot about a lot of issues of adversity, amongst them anti-Asian incidents.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is personality. Like I tend to be an optimist, but not one unrealistically so. I'll say that the day and the 2 days after Atlanta that just really did me in, right? And the day after, I do like a weekly webinar. I mean, I'm on Zoom quite a bit and I'm leading a fair number of meetings. Like it was really hard for me to keep it together, especially the day after. But then, the week after it got better, but I know, for example, Jennifer Lee, my colleague, she's with AAPI Data, and I've known her for about a decade now. She's Korean American, and for her, it was just really hard for several weeks to just keep it together. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I guess what keeps me going is, part of it is I study other issues too, and I run a center that is trying to advance more equity in our portion of the state. So it's this area east of LA. The way I say it, it's a region about the size of the state of South Carolina in geography and population. So I just feel like I don't really have the option of rest. So I'm just like going. At some point, I will get some rest later this summer, but I still haven't tapped out. And I am hearing, colleagues that just have needed to tap out. It's just been overwhelming. And not just because of hate, just, pandemic. And one thing I will say is that my wife and kids have been in Canada for the academic year. So that's actually not been healthy for me because I'm just working all the time. But they'll be back in a couple of weeks. So I think I will restore some of that work-life balance pretty soon.
Gosh, I'm really glad to hear that. So you can get some hugs in, right? You have a dog or anything, or
I don't. My parents live nearby, so I have been able to get some familial contact, but yeah.
That's good. Well, right on time. It's 8. Karthik, thank you so much for talking about this, and just like you've given us a bunch of story ideas, and just I wish I could regularly just like download your data.
That's one thing I'm thinking, folks, like either through Zoom or maybe through some other. I had pitched to AAJA National a while ago of just doing something quarterly in which we just have like a kind of popcorn type session, and so if folks are open to that, I'd love to do this, regularly, because as much as possible, we would love for data and research to inform storytelling and news coverage. So happy to do it in the future.
Yeah, I think that would be great to have a check-in, and just to know what the latest data is from you. And just, I mean, for us, for selfish reasons, if we're feeling a little dry on stories, I know just from listening to you, there's several things I've been thinking, oh, whoops, I should be checking in on that. So
yeah.
So great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Teresa, for putting this together, and everybody for joining us. And Karthik, I will be probably talking to you next time on the phone. So,
and I want to give a special shout out. I see Audrey Dow asking a lot of questions and sharing great info. So, and Audrey is a colleague in the education equity space. So thank you, Audrey. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Audrey. All right. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Take care. Have a good weekend. The weekend is here. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josie. Thank you. Bye.